Cool. So everybody, welcome. I know there's been a little bit of a gap, but it was worth the wait. No pressure, Steve Hearsum. It was worth the wait. We are here again for another masterclass, a delightful masterclass. For us in the UK, it's raining outside, but we are going to be blossoming daffodils here today with Steve, hopefully with a wee bit of banter. We are all about experts in a world of 4D, remembering that we really want interactivity here. Although, the reality is that we kind of end up getting like, concertinaed Q&A at the end of these sessions. So I'm kind of conscious of that. So let's see where we get to today. So maybe we can have a little bit more of an open forum. As always, we are recording today's session, and that session will be put up for the rest of the community members to catch up on replay, but also we do reserve the right to use some snippets of this in social media, and also we will share that with our masterclass expert today, which is Steve, for him to use as well for his own promotion. So if you feel that way inclined, then ditch yourself off the video. Otherwise, please keep your beautiful faces smiling for us throughout today's session. LeadIn 4D is a community. It is a community focused on the evolution of leadership and change for a world of 4D. And what do we mean by 4D, my beautiful members? We mean digital. It's everywhere. We are digital. Digital is us, which means that it's creating so much data, 2.5 quintillion bytes of the stuff. And when we put those two things together, it creates a Goldilocks zone called disruption. And added to that disruption, we have things like societal disruptions, economics, and environmental disruptions as well. What do those three things mean for us in terms of a little bit of a flow? It means that as leaders, as conscious leaders in a world of 4D, we really need to be thinking more about design, the design of how we practice our leadership, the design of our decision making, the design of our organizations, our workforce, our team interventions, engagements, products and services, et al. So I am doing something a little bit special today. I am kiboshing today's session very briefly with an announcement. Steve, I'm sorry, I will be super, super quick. I want to announce that we are going to do a LeadIn 4D challenge, and it's going to be in the public domain. What do I mean by a challenge? We are going to set a 7 or 14-day challenge that we will launch every single day at the same time, a new challenge, which will be based on one of 3 themes. And I would like everybody on today's masterclass to pop into chat which one of the themes they would like us to focus our first challenge on. So the first challenge might be on productivity hacks. So what we will do every day for 7 to 14 days, we will post a productivity hack across all of social media and our own community, which helps leaders increase their productivity. So it's literally going to be that, a productivity hack a day. Or do we actually do a 7 or 14-day challenge that is all about data mindfulness? And wait for it, what are we going to do here? I'm going to actually share a 1-minute meditation for 7 to 14 days based on data mindfulness. So that's the second option. And the third option is 7 to 14 days of daily challenge for helping our leaders out there in the world become more human-centered in their leadership practice. What does that mean? It basically means every day it's going to be a hack, not on productivity, but it's going to be a hack on how the leader can increase the human experience, either for themselves or for people around them. So those number 1, productivity hack. Number 2, data mindfulness. The Mel herself going to be doing 1-minute meditations on data mindfulness. A little bit weird, but let's give it a go. Or number 3, human-centered leadership, that human experience. Just jot it into throughout today. Just think about it, but just jot them into chat, which one you'd like us to do. And that's the one that we'll go with based on the numbers and the responses. And finally, we're going to be launching a summit, a LeadIn 4D summit, which is going to be in May or in June. And basically, it's going to be masterclasses, panel discussions, and interviews with people from all over the world. We're going to do Northern and Southern Hemisphere timings. And the likelihood is on our design at the moment that it's going to be 4 days long. So we'll let you know a little bit more about that as and when, and really be keen for your support, A, to be involved, and B, to promote that. So the LeadIn 4D Challenge and LeadIn 4D Summit, which brings me, by the way, thank you, Steve. Thank you for letting me kibosh today's session on that. Which brings me to today's session, which is another one of our wonderful masterclass series. And please welcome and give a warm welcome to Steve Hearsum, who's going to be talking about the whole system and nothing but the system. And look, I have not put a picture of Steve up. I've put a picture of an otter. And as always, I say every time we have a masterclass, it's not for me to introduce the speaker, it's for the speaker to introduce themselves. So Steve, over to you, but can you please explain the otter to us before I go off?
There's two reasons. Hello everyone, there's two reasons. Firstly, I mean, who's not going to love a cute furry mammal? And no PowerPoint deck should ever be published without a furry mammal. It's one of the facts of life, and most businesses don't appreciate that. On a more serious note, aside from the fact that otters are quite incredible creatures, they are alpha predators. Canadian sea otters, in fairly recent scientific research, what they've demonstrated is that Canadian sea otters are effectively a key part of maintaining the health of entire ecosystems within shoreline waters in Canada. So in terms of a systems perspective, and by the way, I didn't know Mel was going to put the otter up, so I'm improvising here. This is all off the cuff, but there is actually a serious link. Otters are a really good example of whole system ecology and whole system feedback loops and how you keep a whole system healthy. And as I said before, they're really bloody cute. In terms of who I am, I'm gonna reverse this actually. I'm going to say one thing. Mel's introduced me as an expert. I would actually disabuse you of the notion that I'm the expert in anything, because I don't believe that experts have the answers, certainly when it comes to organisations. If I tell you I'm writing a book called No Silver Bullet, which is about the way in which there's a functional collusion between leaders in organisations and various different players, consultants, gurus, business schools, in terms of the idea that there can be a guaranteed answer or a quick fix. I don't believe there is a silver bullet for anything. That probably gives you a sense of my thinking. But I guess my question for you is, what do you want to know about me? I don't know what you want to know. What would serve you to know about me to make the next 45 minutes or so worth your time?
So certainly from my perspective, Steve, it would be really good to get a flavour of the diversity and the variety of your background. So the different things that you've touched into, I think would be really good for everybody to understand a little bit more of, because clearly we're going to be talking about the single subject. And I'd just like to say to everybody, welcome to today's masterclass session, where we are bringing to you a person that knows a little bit more than other people, but not as much as other people in the world. Steve, over to you.
So what one might I imagine, please do ask me questions though, and I don't want to keep this long. My background is I used to work in telecoms. I worked at The Guardian, for those of you who are familiar with newspaper publishing. I launched their dating service, Soulmates. And as Claire, who I've worked with before here, has heard me say before, if you want to know how to meet a Guardian reader, talk to me. I'll tell you what to put in the advert. If you don't want to meet a Guardian reader, it's really simple. Tell them you read the Daily Mail. It's like oil and water. They will never, ever attract each other. And in my time at The Guardian, I was one of the only people I was the only person to volunteer to go onto a project that was looking at the operational efficiency and cross-functional working across the entire business. Because for me, it was entirely obvious. I couldn't understand why this bit wasn't talking to that bit. And if that person could talk to that person, or that bit could connect to that bit, this was logical. So I got myself involved in that project. And from that point on, since the late 90s until now, I've progressively become more involved in working on change in human systems, often driven by technology. So that includes whether you call it digital technology and the whole stuff from the .com era, right through to customer service, CRM systems, sales order processing, the way in which technology impacts the functioning of an organisation. In recent years, I've become more embroiled in the field of organisational development, which you may be familiar with. I spent a few years at Roffey Park, and I'm just about to step down as co-chair of the Organisational Development Network Europe. In terms of what I do, or rather how I do it, I'll say this. I tend to say that I work really in two areas now. I'm interested in strategic alignment in organisations, and I'm interested in collaborative practice. Because if you can't get clear in your head on the why, what, and how, then you're kind of stuffed. And if you can't collaborate and you can't do conflict well, then it doesn't matter how well you strategically align. So that tends to be where I work. And I also operate on the basis of I don't work with clients who are interested in better sameness. So if you want change, but you really rather things don't change, then I don't work with you. I only work with clients who actually do want things to change, because otherwise it's a waste of their time and my time. So that's kind of just in a nutshell. And I also have a new puppy, which you'll probably see at some point. It's 4 months old. I'm slightly sleepy because I'm doing all the nights. But Solly will probably make an appearance at some point and yip in the background. Anything else you want to know? What would you like to know? Was that enough?
That's great for me, unless there's something from everybody else. But I can, let's keep today's session informal and open. So if anybody wants to do a shout out, just pop your hand up on the screen, and I'll hopefully keep an eye on you, and then come over to you so that we can get your question aired to Steve. But we'll have Q&A at the end. So Steve, you and I have known each other for a wee while. The reason for me asking you to do today's masterclass session, a little bit of stuff in here which is personal for me, but equally a few people that are members of the community have also come to me and said there's a lot of kind of academic stuff around systems thinking and systems leadership, and it gets touted around a lot. What exactly does systems leadership mean? What exactly do we mean when we talk systems thinking? So I think a springboard, a place to start from, is to get your view on the definition of those two things in a way that is not academic or jargon driven, but something that we can all, as 4D practitioners and leaders, kind of understand in simple language.
Okay. You can do a search online and very rapidly come up with some nice definitions of systems thinking. One thing you'll see come up is that it's a way of thinking about the world that utilizes systems theory, which then raises the question, what's systems theory? It's another way of looking at it, and there's a guy called Jeffrey Bateson, who some of you may have heard of, I don't know. He talks about the idea that it's, a system is any unit structured on feedback. Peter Senge is one of the people who's popularized the whole idea of systems thinking. His definition was a system as a perceived whole whose elements hang together because they continually affect each other over time and operate to a common purpose, unquote. So that's what Senge talks about. Wikipedia is just as good a place to go as any, much as my academic wife would tell you that you never go to Wikipedia for accuracy. Systems thinking is the ability or skill to perform problem solving in a complex system. And what you notice when you start hearing those definitions is you start to have to wrap your head around questions like complexity. So do we understand what complexity is? What's complexity theory? What's the difference between systems thinking and systems doing? What's a systems thinking informed practice as a consultant or as a leader? So there's a whole load of stuff here. I guess my take on it is that a systems thinking approach means a number of things. There are key things that you have to pay attention to. And if it's useful, I will just throw up one slide because it's easier than me reading off it. I would summarize it as this, that it's a system. A system is one where there is the notion of feedback, that there's the idea of repetition. So this idea of recursion comes up in some of the definitions, that you are able to see patterns. If you can't see the patterns in the system, then you're probably not a systems thinker. There's the notion of the whole and the part. So the whole system, but the part being the individual agents within it, you as the individual human being. Because there's also here an overlap to the notion of complex adaptive systems, which comes from computing. So just to give you kind of a heads up around that, because that informs some of this. There's this notion of seeing the system. And if you see the system, it's the idea that you're able to take an outsider perspective to see the whole. You can't see the whole unless you've got some distance. So how can you be in it, but at the same time separate from it and see it? as I said already, the notion of complexity. Do you understand the notion of complexity, and can you understand the difference between a complex system and a complicated system? Because they're not the same. But the other thing I find interesting is it's a very tribal field. There are spats between some of the thinkers in the fields. You'll have people say one thing and then you'll hear somebody else say, well, no, I don't agree with that. So, there's what a friend of mine talks about is the idea of thought collectives arise around this. So you have the thought collective that talks about systems thinking, but within that you then have the ones that are more informed by complexity. You have the human systems dynamics crowd, of which I'm also happen to sit within that because I'm qualified in HSD. And then there's the whole question of the blurring of the boundaries between these different thought collectives. So one of the things I guess I'd want to say is it's the idea that you can get one uniform definition of it, I think, is an illusion and absurdity. You kind of have to sift and hunt around for some definitions like the ones I shared with you earlier on that kind of fit for you, and then look at the key elements. And I'd argue that the key elements I've listed here on the left-hand side are the ones that you typically see show up when people talk about the idea of a system or systems thinking. Does that make sense before I say anything else? And by the way, if anybody disagrees with me, please tell me, because, like I said, I don't have the answers. I have opinions and questions, but I don't come with the definitive right answer on this stuff. So that would be my observation. The other thing that I think, it's worth holding in mind is the whole idea of complexity. Out of curiosity, are you all clear on the difference between complexity and complex and complicated? I'm assuming that no? Yeah? Some yes and no. So in a nutshell, the difference between complex and complicated, an example would be getting your carburetor fixed in your car is complicated. Give it to a mechanic and he or she over time will eventually work out what's wrong. Complex is trying to change the behaviour of the person who's driving the car. Like your husband or wife who likes 2 bottles of Chateauneuf de Pape before they take it out for a spin, or your 92-year-old granny who can't see straight anymore and bumps into lampposts. So that's complex. That's an adaptive challenge, as it's sometimes called. So climate change, complex. Brexit, complex. Brexit was treated as a complicated problem. It wasn't. It was complex. So that would be the distinction in my mind.
Cool, thanks, Steve. Do you know, it's really interesting when you put those elements together in terms of a definition for or a way of thinking about systems thinking. And I'm really pleased that you've said it's kind of something that you almost need to go away and do a little bit of a look-see and a little bit of a route around yourself to get a sense of what it means for you in your environment and your own conditions. Quick question comes to me before I ask you about the definition of systems leadership, is this, when is a system not a system?
Oh, now we're getting into philosophy. Well, you're a system, Mel. You are the human body is a system. I would argue that it's not a system when it doesn't meet most of the conditions in that slide I shared. If there's no feedback loop in terms of the definition or the understanding of what is a system, then it's not a system. It's something else. It's an inanimate object. It's fixed. So, I'd argue that all organisations, by definition, are human systems.
That's brilliant. And the reason why I asked that was not to be contentious so much as it was just, in our practice as 4D leaders, it is, equally important for us to look inward to ourselves as it is outwardly. And when I saw those elements that you put down, that's exactly what went through my head was I could apply this to my inner self as much as I could apply this to an outward condition, environment, people, etc., etc.
So where I've gone with that is a lot of the work I'm doing at the moment is with internal agents of change in organisations. So these are people who are HRBPs, these are organisational development practitioners, these are org design people, these are change managers. These are the people who are tasked by senior leaders to change organisations on the behalf of the C-suite and boards. And what's interesting is the people I work with The ones that struggle are the ones who cannot see the system. The ones who struggle are the ones who cannot see the complexity. The ones that struggle are the ones that cannot see their part in that as a human being. So, it's not enough when you're talking about organizational change or systems change to have an intellectual understanding of this, to be able to see the system and go, oh, there we go, it's over there, it's this thing. If you are wanting to change it, then you are at the very least going to have a relationship where you can intervene. And for most of us, that means we're probably part of the system somehow. So who I am, how I show up, what I regard as being valid data, and how I then choose to behave and act is going to be an intervention in the system. And that actually can be really scary. That can be really scary and exposing. I think that's one of the other traps here is that we see systems thinking as an intellectual pursuit. It's not. Not when it comes to organizations. Mm-hmm. Not if you want to change an organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's lovely. I love the way you said that. I think that was really eloquent. And I've noted it down as might be one of my quotes for the week. What springs to mind now is just very, very briefly, is just when you said that any organization essentially is a human system. Looking at the 4Ds and thinking about technology and thinking about the technology system of an organization, looking at data and looking at the data system of an organization, as well as the human element. I think where I'm going with here is, in an organization, we've got different levels of systems thinking because of people's definition of it. So you might have people in the tech team, for example, that might be systems thinkers, but their narrow field of systems thinking might be more architecturally driven or structurally driven and tech driven. And then, you mentioned yourself, the HR people and the OD people will potentially gravitate more to that human system. Is it that, talking about your strategic alignment and collaborative practice, is now the time where we actually needed to bring these people together more, because that really brings their own complexity together, and show its value. I know where I'm going with this one. I'm hoping that because you're writing down, you're able to take my thoughts, which you sometimes do.
So where I've gone with this is, I've gone to shame and anxiety, because I hear too many examples of senior leadership teams feeling quite rightly they need to make large investments in technology. Mm-hmm. And I've heard more than one time the story of a senior leader or senior leadership team investing in technology, but not actually understanding what it does.
Yep, same.
Not knowing why they're spending the money, but more in a more human level, feeling distress and shame that they don't understand it, and they also can't reveal that they don't know. It's not okay not to know. So that then raises an interesting question, which is, do the people at the top of the organisation, because they're at the top, actually see the system more clearly than the rest of us? Sometimes. Do the people who are other places in the system sometimes see the organisation more clearly than the people at top? Yeah, often. So I don't think you can pull on the thread you're dangling there, Mel, without going into a really human place of the shame and anxiety and our willingness to actually acknowledge what we don't know. The second bit there, you asked a question about, I think, the relationship almost between leaders and the people who do the change. So one of my observations is that senior leadership teams and organisations do a really good job of saying, we need this to happen and this to change. We need a change management function or a program office or these people to be in these change roles. And they kind of then let go of it. It's like, we've job done. And you're then left with this group of people who have been tasked with actually doing the change. And those are the people I spend a lot of time with. And what becomes really clear is it's not easy on the inside. That those people, to quote a senior leader from a client organisation I'm working with at the moment, a very big UK technology business, massive one, as I was doing the diagnostic work, we were talking about the people going through this program where we're going to be developing their skills to become better agents of change. He said, we need them to operate at several grades above their pay level. Okay, now just think about that for a moment. So you, the senior leader, who's responsible for all the change, you want the people you're tasking to facilitate the change and be your transformation people to not only do their jobs, but do it at several grades below your pay grade, but be able to work at your level. So they need to be skilled in change and actually also be leaders. Okay, that's really interesting. And what I don't see, I don't think I can think of one organisation I've ever worked with this has got this right. I don't see a genuinely honest conversation between senior leadership teams and the people they task with change where they are in actually an ongoing dialogue. Mm. And so what I see most often is the people tasked with change are left isolated, unsure of who they can go to, unsure of what will happen if they do speak truth to power. And much of my work is actually supporting and challenging them to get comfortable with speaking truth to power and recontracting with senior leaders so they can have the conversations that need to happen. So that is a real live issue, and I don't see many people talking about that. In fact, I'm pretty much the only person I know who points it out, and I hope other people do start saying it more. And the last bit is, in all this talk about systems, we forget actually, and this is not my line, this comes from a wonderful woman called Maxine Craig. She wrote something really interesting recently. She said it's not about systems, it's about place. We don't work and live in systems, we work and live in places. And the language is important, because the moment you start using the language of system, you're then potentially, if I asked you, if I were to do this now, tell me the organisation you work for, or your biggest client or most recent client, an organisation is like a what? What's your dominant metaphor? Just throw it out. An organisation is like a what? My client system is like a what?
Second home.
A what?
Second home. That's where you
Second home. Okay. Another one?
An oil tanker.
Oil tanker. Second home. Oil tanker. What else? Give us one more.
I was going to say a sick human being, but that's sick.
Okay. So the language and the metaphors we use are really important, because they talk to the assumptions we hold about the nature of change and the assumptions we hold about organisations. So if we are continually, as practitioners or leaders, going on and walking around and banging on about the organisation as a system, then we run the risk of forgetting that these are actually places. These are places where human beings work together, and they start to become dehumanized. So one of the big traps for me with systems thinking and systems theory is it's useful, but it's not the truth, and it can become dehumanizing.
Steve, can I just say something? That a lot of these places where I've worked, it somehow becomes about the KPIs. They bring these systems in to try and get the KPIs in, but it's usually to, talk about getting the best out of somebody way, 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 above their pay scale. And I've been one of those people, and I ended up getting RSI due to the system that I had to put in, but it was something called Peregrine GSS. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's a ticketing agent. And basically, I ended up having to bridge the gaps between all the different, the different departments within the organization. It was a massive corporate company called KBR Halliburton. I don't know if you've heard of them or not. And so I was tasked to basically get USA and Algeria and everywhere, Dubai, UK, everywhere working together, and all the different software departments through to HR, through to everybody, from setting up users, the whole thing had to be set up. And they just put me in there and said, right, plug the gaps. And I was literally working as some kind of management consultant, but if I told you what I was earning, it's nobody's business. And I ended up getting RSI because of the clicking function that was involved.
Yeah. So the kind of
about what that does with the standard mouse, with the clicking, I think that's really important that we consider that.
Yeah, and what you've just described there, something I find myself saying to lots of the internals I work with when it comes up, is you are the node through which the crazy flows. If you are being tasked with changing an organisation, and you're being tasked as an internal change manager, OD consultant, HRBP, it doesn't really matter what the label is, but the ask is, we want you to help change this organisation. Then I put money on the fact that all the anxiety and the crazy will end up flowing through you. because you're going to be having the conversations with all the people who need to be involved in order to change things, but that means you're also going to be having the conversations about their anxiety, the emotion, the taboos, the stuff that's hidden. And that does not get talked about enough. It does not get acknowledged. Sanjay, you popped in a question which I wanted to make sure we picked up.
Yeah.
So how to address the fast pace of technology obsolescence, especially when it takes time for an organisation to adopt it. So my interpretation of that is, well, literally, how do you keep up? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, and that's one. And second is like, what I mean is change management relevant? Because by the time you execute a change management, the technology has changed.
Right. So my really quick and dirty answer to that is if you have a model of change, if your assumptions about change orientate towards the idea that change is linear, A to B, cause and effect, you're kind of screwed, because you'll never be able to keep up with the pace of change. If you orientate towards a model of, or the nature of change as being something that's iterative, that is continually emergent, that is unplannable and unknowable, then if nothing else, you'll be more comfortable with the anxiety that can be induced by the fact that things are happening so fast. But you're more likely to be able to respond in the moment to what is, rather than worrying about the fact that your project plan in your Gantt chart is totally out of date. So I think, there's something here about accepting that it's moving really fast, because at least then you might be in a better emotional state and intellectual state to respond. But what you're pulling on there, Sanjay, I think is also talking to, this is my build, and it may not be where you're going, so I'm just going to build on this, is this talks to the way in which organisations and senior leaders think they need to do change. And a wonderful example of this is something like ProSci. So are you familiar with ProSci? Have you? Yeah, so I'm seeing a couple of nods. ProSci is a change methodology. It's originally from the US. It's where the ADKAR model comes from. It's for personal change, and ADKAR is actually very useful. It's worth looking at. And in some respects, it has utility. But the problem is, it is predicated on the idea that if you learn all these tools and models and you plan everything, then everything will be okay. I had one of my clients paid for me to do the certification. I sat through 3 days and nigh on 400 slides. And the facilitator and consultant who did it, he was bloody good. He was really good. He said at one point, 70% of this depends on dialogue. But you would never know that from any of the materials they use. Okay? So looping back to your question, Sanjay, unless you can have the conversations you need to and really get into the stickiness that arises as things are starting to move so fast that you don't know what the hell to do, then you're not going to be able to survive. And some of the organisations I talk to who use ProSci, one organisation I know of, 2 people on the course laughed because they said, we didn't realise how many people in our organisation were qualified in ProSci until we told our friends and colleagues we were doing this course, because everybody's doing it, but nothing's changing. And I asked why, and the reason is because they're qualifying and certifying people in this thing, but leadership are seeing change as being, get somebody certified in this tool and then everything will happen. That's the antithesis of systems thinking.
Yeah, and I also think that there's something that you're raising there as well, and I'll go back to Sanjay to close off on that. You talk about without the conversation. I also think that there's, from looking at our framework, and there's I think there's an alignment as well as a relevance here, which is action. Insight comes from action. Action doesn't come from insight. And in order to address that fast pace of technology, being able to respond rather than react is definitely to see it as iterative, but also to build our resilience up with having that experimental practice and that kind of, actioning in on that. Sanjay, just back to you to bring that to a close.
No, because what you said is that leaders do not understand technology so easily. So by the time they understand, as you said, there's a gap between the leaders who think of the technology and the people who execute it. Mm-hmm. So I think rather than having a change management itself, like what the LeadIn 4D brings about is a change of mindsets. The full organization accepts that things are changing and they develop a mindset to constantly evolve. That's my thought process. Rather than having change management to me is like a one-time change of organizational processes or whatever.
Yeah.
Bringing up new culture.
Yeah. So there's somebody I once heard, I met at a conference a few years ago. He'd been working, he used to work for Hewlett Packard in the 70s. And he said, we were having a conversation about the impact of digital on organizations. And he leant in and he said in a slightly tired way, look, there's always been a gap between the leading edge of technology and social processes. The only difference now is that digital makes that gap widen faster. The underlying challenge remains the same. It's how we work together, it's social processes, it's the interactions. The difference that makes a difference maybe is the speed. But unless you're actually able to work with the social processes, the rest is irrelevant.
Mm.
And I've seen, to be clear, actually, just to kind of labour the point, I've not, in 25 years of working in organisations around technology, I've yet to see anything or hear anything that disproves that assumption. And I'm really up for being proved wrong. I genuinely am. But I've not come across one piece of data that disproves that as a hypothesis.
I think there is good news on the horizon, though, based on that, because I do think that things like conscious leadership that lean into role modeling, it's like if you look at the history and military and the armed forces, in order for this to work, there's got to be one person that starts moving in order for other people to follow in some way, shape or form, as long as that's caveated by authenticity and so on and so forth. So yet again, we're describing that there's no silver bullet and there's no single answer to it, because there is by definition complexity. Steve, I just want to come back to something that's really interesting that you said there, because I just want to bring it to a close. You mentioned that this gap, which Sanjay has highlighted, the gap between the leaders and the people that are tasked with the delivery of change, not necessarily just in technology, but change generally. I think one of the things there as well to be mindful of is that there is, because of that, an increased level of stress and anxiety that's coming into change practitioners or digital specialists. And we know through one of our partners that the stress levels, the well-being of these people is increasing, because they are unduly tasked with leadership and full accountability for change and digital transformation in a way that is, like you said earlier on, don't get paid for it, but actually it's more than that. It's actually, that gap between the change and the leaders. And I think that, you alluded to that. That is really super important. You go.
Yeah. Well, part of the problem is, I kind of touched on this, but I just want to, if I expand on it, is that when you say that people are under more stress, well, yeah, because the ask is you need to be able to exhibit leadership skills, and you also need to be a bloody good consultant. And that means not a consultant in a suited and booted, come in with nice PowerPoints kind of way. That means you need to have a practice that means you are able to go into a room full of potentially senior stakeholders and hold the mirror up and ask them questions or make observations that they are going to find really uncomfortable. But if you're to be of service to the system, there is nothing else you can do. And that is actually, so one of the things I find myself saying at the moment, I've said it twice to people in a client recently, is you're going to have to make a choice as to whether the question you're answering is, how do I progress in my career in this organisation and move up, or how do I be of most service to the system? Because at some point they're going to be in opposition and not the same thing. And I think that actually is one of the things that's in the shadow when we talk about business partnering and internal consulting. I don't think that gets talked about, because the other thing that gets missed is, and again, this is my view, it's a hypothesis, and I have loads of data from my own work, and I see nothing to disabuse me of this, is that I think having change functions or program offices or named centres of excellence is actually an absurdity, because it's answering the wrong question. It's saying, how do we work out who the experts are that need to change this organisation? The question you need to ask is, where do we build the change capability in order to change this organisation? And who needs to have that? They're not the same question.
Yeah, which is the oxymoron of, if you're talking about complexity and complex systems, actually, you're trying to put a square peg into a round hole. Steve,
there's a question also I saw from Leading in 4D.
Yes, I know, and thank you. I was just about to bring your attention to it.
Good example of systems leadership. And
we haven't actually talked about defining that. We've talked about systems thinking. It would really be nice to actually talk about what on earth does that mean. Okay,
I did a little hunt earlier today to find some definitions. And what I found was this. And you could find more, but this is as good a place as any to start. And what's interesting is where these two examples come from, what they tell us. So William Tate is a really lovely guy. He's been around for a while. He runs something called, I think, the Systems Leadership Institute. And his work is worth reading, not just about systems thinking and systems leadership, but about leadership. He's a really lovely man. And so his definition of systems leadership is that. I'm not going to read it to you because obviously you don't need me to. Nothing drives me mad more than people reading verbatim what's on a slide. But what's interesting, he takes an organisational development approach to this. He explicitly talks about OD. Now, the thing that's interesting about the second one, I think that came from the Northwest Leadership Academy, or one of the Northwest academies in the NHS. That's a definition within the NHS. Now, the NHS is a really interesting example. So here you can see the key things that often get talked about with systems leadership. This thing about working beyond organisational boundaries or across organisational boundaries. That this idea that you have to collaborate. Collaboration becomes key. The two things here are cross-boundary and collaboration. Now, let's take the NHS as an example. If you look across the NHS in the last 70 years, and I've got a slide somewhere that I could share with you, there have been 2 or 3 dozen reports on leadership and management in the NHS. And every few years they say, this is the type of leadership the NHS needs to develop. About 10 years ago, I think it was transformative leadership, and then it was servant leadership, or it was the other way around. Most recently, it was systems leadership. I did a session at an NHS conference about 4 years ago, and there was one moment where everybody's bottoms started to get very squeaky on their seats. Because what I said to people in the room is, the thing is, this starts with you. If you want systems leadership to be live, you have to be able to collaborate more effectively. If you want to collaborate effectively, you have to be able to do conflict well. Now, if any of you who've worked with the NHS, and I know Richard has, one of the things that the NHS really struggles with is doing conflict well. They really struggle with collaboration because it's a system, it's an organisation where the model for leadership is top-down, command and control, which works against the idea that you can speak truth to power at any level. Collaboration requires or implies that if Sanjay, for example, was the chief executive of a trust, if I'm genuinely able to be a systems leader, I could go to Sanjay and say, Sanjay, I need to have a conversation with you because that talk you did at a town hall last week raised some questions about what we're doing and blah, blah, blah. I need permission. That's totally countercultural. So systems leadership, unless you can collaborate, will never happen. And most organisations I know confuse collaboration with cooperation, because they prize harmony over having the conflict necessary for a win-win. They get the two confused. So in the NHS, systems leadership became this thing, but unless you're prepared to do the work proper, which is to work on the relationships, to work on culture, to work on collaboration, it doesn't matter what label or flavour of leadership that you adopt. I think in the NHS, the NHS now have a new NHS leadership model. If you do a search for it, you'll find it on the Leadership Academy website. It's something called like the Leadership Cube. Systems leadership is already beginning to fade into the background. They've got a new silver bullet, a new thing that they're saying is going to be the answer. It won't be because they're still struggling to do the work proper.
give you an idea of how slow things are, that was actually done in 2014. I had to look it up yesterday. And
what, the cube?
The cube, yeah.
2014.
Wow.
Yeah, it's been around for 6 years, and they're starting to
Wow.
use it more in a more distributed way at the moment. But it's not new.
Yeah, and it's still going to miss the point unless they can do the work proper. Yeah, if you want to know about when the NHS, what it's really like at senior level, talk to Richard, because he probably knows more about that stuff than anybody I know at the moment. Yes, you do. All the people who do.
Like you, unexpert.
Yeah, I was going to call that one out. Well done, Richard. Well done. That's fantastic. That is just so interesting. So it's funny, isn't it? As soon as you make it a thing, you know, you're kind of down the rabbit hole, aren't you? It's just yet again, who we are is understanding this is human to human, albeit a little bit of human to machine coming into play with, you know, the fifth industrial revolution that gets talked about a lot now. But
so Mel, just want to pick up this thing about, you know, where is an example of good systems leadership? There's two individual human beings that come into my mind. One is a guy called Morrison, who's fairly well known on the conference circuit, who's been Chief Human Resources Officer or similar in a number of organisations in always different sectors. He's moved from Penguin Random House to now being the HRD or the CHRO of a water utility company, which is not normally a transition, you see. And what's interesting about Neil is I interviewed him for the book I'm writing, and he doesn't talk about systems leadership. It's not language he uses. But I would argue he's actually modelling that, because he's utterly label agnostic. He doesn't care what job titles his people have. All he cares about is, do they have the capability? Do they have the support they need in order to do the job? And is there the permission from them to do that? And he creates the permission and the conditions for them to do that. He doesn't care about the label. He is creating the conditions for effectively collaboration and systems leadership to happen across boundaries. The other person that comes to mind is a woman who I think is retired now, who I met in Brighton, where I live, who used to work at Amex. And she was unusual. So bear in mind, Amex is very suited and booted. So, you know, people tend to, as they move up, at least it used to be the case, wear very nice suits. And she was very Brighton. She wore really natty, kind of trendy suits, not kind of exec suits. She had short hair. And she would describe going into a meeting with her peers, and people, one or two people would lean into her saying, "Oh God, I wish I could be like you." And the way she ran her team, she had a team of 150 odd people. She had people in their early 20s, she had students, she had people with more piercings and tattoos than you can care to name. She had old age pensioners, she had part-time mums, she had everything you care to name. She had 25-year-olds who were also suited and booted, who wanted to be the next CEO of Amex. And she was able to hold all of them. And she created the conditions for all of them to work together because she understood how to work a human system. She understood how to create the conditions for collaboration and how to attend to the similarities and differences within her team. And that's something that I don't think we've talked about. I'd argue that unless you can attend to similarities and differences, then you're not actually going to be able to do systems leadership.
And was she, this example of this lady that you've just mentioned, Steve, was she perceived with credibility by more traditional mindsets and senior leaders in the system? Because that is also very, very important.
I think she was. I don't think she had an aspiration to become the next CEO, though. No,
and that's not the question that I'm asking.
Yeah, absolutely. But she was well regarded. Yeah.
Yeah. And that kind of I just want to go quickly to Claire on that, just to ask whether there are any thoughts, because you know very much what Steve's just been talking about is that sense of diversity and inclusion and that removing of labels, which is something that you talked a little bit about with us a few weeks ago as well, Claire.
Yeah, absolutely. When I did the diversity and inclusion masterclass, it's still a pleasant surprise to hear stories like that, Steve, even with the increased focus on diversity and inclusion. I know you posted something earlier on LinkedIn around unconscious bias training and the debate going on around that at the moment. But I sit here as a D&I consultant, and I think, oh, I want to ask Steve more about that person. Who is that person who's breaking down the boundaries? And to your question there, Mel, being taken seriously and having credibility, because it's still an exception rather than a rule, and what a shame that is.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
If your starting question, Mel, was, what is systems thinking? I think that's one of the parts of this, that kind of the shadow of this, is that if you really do engage with it as a more than just a concept or kind of an intellectual construct, then you have to engage with difference. And if you're prepared to engage, if you're going to engage with difference, that means you're almost certainly going to rub up against the shadow side of what's going on in your organisation and some of the uncomfortable stuff. And I'd also argue, if you're going to really do it, then you're going to have to ask some uncomfortable questions about your own assumptions and beliefs and values. If you're really going to. And I don't know whether that is always explicitly talked about when it comes to the notion of systems thinking.
And it's quite interesting, because everything that I've heard from you today, which is that sense of, being able to collaborate, but also deal with conflict, that strategic alignment and the sense of collaborative practice, that, just what we just talked about there in terms of being able to hold value without labeling just because it is value. So it's, that sort of diversity and inclusion bit. I think there's something there which is which points to, it is important, whether you're a leader or just a general employee, to have the space and the support to work on your inner well-being and and resilience, and that inner leader or that inner worker in all of us, as well as the outward skills that we seem to focus on so much.
There's a point that I'm just mulling over the 4D. When I make the links, you talk about digital and data creating disruption, which then leads to questions of design. And what came to mind as I was mulling on that and hearing you talk was something that a woman I heard at an event I ran a couple of years ago, who was a very senior org design person in the bank, talk about. And she said at one point, all I care about is two things. Does a consultant understand change in human systems? And do they know how to intervene in human systems? And I said to her, so can I just be really explicit? You're saying you don't care what they call themselves, whether they're a change consultant, OD consultant, HR consultant, DNI. She said, no, that's all I care about. The rest is immaterial. Now, I'd happen to agree with that, but if you follow the logic of that and you extrapolate, the implications of that, that means a lot of the rhetoric, a lot of the stuff we talk about around the nature of change and what we need to do in organisations is, I think the technical term is bollocks. It's rubbish, because the differences between different sorts of organisations are often actually very surface level. The underlying dynamics are universal. You could argue, to be a bit philosophical, it's just another facet of the human condition. It's just creating, particular flavours of our condition. But the underlying dynamics of social processes are the same. Claire?
Actually, sorry, I just noticed Zara had got her hand up before me. Zara, can I just jump just because it's related to Steve's last point there? So imagine if you were in an organisation and you were looking for a consultant to come in and work on a change project then. So what you're saying there is we're all sort of tinkering in the same water, whether we come at it from a D&I angle or a leadership development angle or a digital angle or all the rest of it. So would you argue that then within an organisation, you probably shouldn't have more than one consultant playing in the water at the same time? Strange analogy, you know what I mean?
Yeah, so to take, I think the first bit of that is a really good point. So there's a rider on this, which is we can over-egg the labelling, and we can over-egg the idea that we really need to have an org design specialist. We need a purist in organisational development or a purist in D&I. underneath the skin of that, or underneath the bonnet of it, pick your metaphor of choice, unless they understand change in human systems as well, and unless they know how to intervene in human systems as well, their domain experience, their subject matter expertise is useless. You might as well just get a big book on the subject and drop it on the boardroom table and walk out. You need to have somebody who has those practice skills, the ability to help in human relations. Otherwise, I don't see how they can have an impact.
No. Interesting. Thank you.
Thanks. Zara, just I can see you still got your pen up.
I was going to say, when I first arrived on LinkedIn, everybody was dotted all over the place. They were very disconnected. And I started posting my stories and telling people about my experiences. And before I knew it, I got this gathering from across the world. I had people from India, I had people from America, and everybody was connecting with me, and everybody's tagging me to the point I was going around saying thank you 17 hours a day. It became absolutely ridiculous. And yes, I wasn't interlabeling. I had doctors, I had juniors, I had apprentices, and everybody was on board with me. And the way I went about it was just connecting with people, just having that dialogue with them. And it was about empathy. It was like some kind of, I understand you, I've been in these positions. And another way was being kind over right, just learning to be respectful and actually saying now and again, let's agree to disagree on a couple of points, so that you have to get people collaborating and then drill into the details. So that's the way I went about it. I don't know if any of those points are helpful, but having that understanding of different cultures definitely helps. And telling people we're all equal, and we all matter and everybody can make a difference, and just allowing everybody to have that space. That's something.
Yeah, I agree with that, with the rider, that if we deny that there are inequalities and we deny how power actually works in organisations, then we run the risk of not actually working with the reality.
Yeah, and that's very important.
Mon, you've got a great question there. I think
I love it. I love it.
What do you think? Would be my question. What's your answer?
Well, listening to it, and I must say, it's the very first time I came across system thinking on leadership in such a big picture, or maybe by definition today. Well, I would like to say no, it doesn't mean it, and it doesn't start from the top. But based on my experience, it has very little chances of survival if it doesn't have a solid sponsor leader. Based on the example of Neil you mentioned, I just feel there's a chance to maybe try to plant the seed as an agent of change or change agent.
Yeah,
I do think it needs solid support from the leadership, unfortunately.
Well, it does, but I think you're both. It's both and. So, on the one hand, I think you're right. It can be harder, but on the other hand, there's evidence that it's not always necessarily the case. And I'll give you a specific example, two actually. So one is it's a BOL.com. There is a guy there, and I think if you look at corporaterebels.com, you can probably find the story on there, who effectively catalyzed a radical change in the way that teams work there by unilaterally changing the way his team worked radically, totally, really different to the culture and to the established norms. And that was viral change that then rippled out, because what happened was the teams around his team then started to come to him saying, we want to learn from you and how you're working, because it's clearly working better. So how did you do that? And it began to propagate. So that's a really lovely example of change beginning to happen that way. I mean, and the other example is something like a Beurtzog, the Dutch social care company. Now, what's interesting about them, you're probably familiar with them, they're about 10,000 strong. They are set up with a headquarters of about 200 people. They have no HR function. They have very minimal finance function, because all authority and power is devolved to the individual offices. So there you effectively have autonomous system leadership. People manage and lead within the system. But what's really interesting is when you then find out what happened to the organisations that tried to copy them. So I know this because I interviewed one of the corporate rebels in 2020, and he said, well, other Dutch companies have tried to copy them and it hasn't worked. I said, oh, why? He said, well, they made a big mistake. They tried to copy them, but they weren't prepared to let go of the power at the top. So by definition, it didn't work. So if you think in terms of systems leadership, what they did there, Berthold created the conditions for a form of systems leadership and collaboration. Other companies killed it at birth. They throttled it at birth. So I think it can happen. It's just that it's probably not as easy if you don't have the air cover.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Steve. I'm just conscious of time. That was a great question.
Richard's got a question. He's waving his hand.
My hand. No.
Oh, Richard, I didn't see. Well, if everybody's okay to just carry on just for a couple more minutes, it would be fantastic if we could have Richard's question.
No, I've got to go, I'm afraid.
Throw me a ball or go and find something red. No.
Yeah. No, it was just a question of actually whether even senior leadership are capable in many organizations of creating a system. Oh, hello. System leadership way of thinking about things, because they're just not used to it. And so working in the NHS, when we were looking at a big kind of change vision or future vision for healthcare, senior people absolutely bought into it. But like, it's going to be after I've retired. It's going to take a while to happen, and I wouldn't know how to do it because I've got all these incentives that mean that I have to run my organisation the way I run my organisation. Junior doctors look at it and go, "Oh yeah, when can we have it? Let's go." So the people who want to do it don't have the power to do it. The people who have the power just don't have the incentives to do it, and I think that's true in kind of lots of organisations. So how do you get everybody going, this is the kind of star that we're chasing?
Well, I have an answer.
Oh,
I do have an answer. I'm not saying it's the answer, but I have a possible answer. Actually, there's two. So the first one is, if you want to change a system, you have to have the whole system in the room. If you've got 6,000 people, then you need to, in theory, get 6,000 people in the same room. But if you can't get all 6,000, you sure as hell need to have a representative of every part of the system in the same room. So you have to do whole system change by having the whole system in the same space. So that'd be my first answer. My experience of the NHS, because I've asked people at senior level in the NHS about large group interventions, and it scares them rigid, Richard. They understand conceptually why it would be a good idea, but they're really scared of being exposed. So guess what? They're not going to have the change. The other thing, which is a smaller point, but I think it might be significant, is that I think there's a problem fundamentally with leadership development, which is I don't think the leadership development actually works, and I no longer with clients will agree to do leadership development programs. I will do leadership practice development. I will do leadership supervision. I won't do leadership development programs because I don't believe that they work. I think they collude with the idea that you can send somebody on a 5-day program or 2 2-day modules, and in that discrete container that will do the work, you'll spit them out and they'll go and be a different person. No. So I think there's some assumptions about the nature of how leaders learn that don't stack up. And actually, when you look at the evidence, it doesn't stack up.
Right, I think it's change the value proposition of my
Yeah, and I think certainly in our work, one of the things that we've noticed is that to have a presence of a confidant, whether that's a coach or a mentor, but to have the presence of a confidant for the leaders is also really, really important, because a lot of what needs to be unpicked and delved into are vulnerabilities, or to use your word, the complexities that are inside the leader themselves, that they need support to deal with those things so that they can then lean into things that might feel very, very, very uncomfortable for them and very, very different. Steve, one very quick question coming in from Mon, and then I think we will have to just kind of bring today's session to a close. Where does accountability sit within the system?
By this system, Mon, do you mean in any organisational system?
Well, I mean, in a system thinking, in what we were talking about, when we change everything, and when even the Dutch example, when you give up the power on top, do you give also the accountability up, or are you in the You know, where does it shift with the
Well,
power?
Well, I think when you look at Berthold, what you've got there is just a different way of contracting. So the contract between different people in the system is different to the contract that is in a more conventional organisation with tops, middles and bottoms. So there's different agreements about how power works. There's different agreements about who is responsible, for example, for writing job descriptions and for comps and benefits. They don't have an HR function because they've contracted that is devolved authority and devolved accountability. So the accountability rests with where it needs to rest.
Good answer. Yeah.
And sorry, and the other bit, Mon, that there's an implication to this. It means that a critical number of people in the system need to be able to have adult-to-adult conversations. If they can't, then it probably won't work.
That's great. But and just so something's just come up for me there that I'd like to hear your thoughts on, Steve. In that situation, I know a customer very similar called Satalia, who are, they've got a fantastic, hearing everything that you've described today, I see that throughout their entire human ecosystem, or for want of a better phrase. My question is, when the proverbial hits the fan, who makes the decision? If we've got this kind of, accountability is where it sits, what happens when there is a crisis? What happens when there is a big change? What happens when there is a COVID-19? Do we still need to look up to something? It's kind of, is that?
That's an assumption, Mel. That's
Okay,
an immediate.
just want to, yeah, absolutely. So
the obvious answer to that is look at the military. So you could not get a more hierarchical organisation than say the army. But what happens in at the front line is a troop of soldiers who are in a firefight don't look up. They self-organise and self-manage in the here and now according to need. Leadership with a small L is where it needs to be. So I think it's a really interesting question around, so if you look at some of the examples of organisations that are moving to more self-managed or self-organising units, and there's the large Chinese company run by the Chinese entrepreneur whose name escapes me, where he's got tens of thousands of employees, and he's changed the organisation several times, and they have self-managing, self-organising subunits that all sit within the whole. It's phenomenal. It really challenges the idea that you have to look up in that conventional sense.
What's his job? What's his job then?
What's his job? Well, he's CEO, but in terms of how power is exercised, it's exercised not in a way which is saying I'm going to always be the person who decides what happens. He's creating the conditions for things to happen.
So there will be a moment. So he's in servitude to the whole system as the CEO. Yeah. So therefore, he does hold accountability in situations to make decisions. Yeah. Okay. So leadership is basically a little bit of everywhere. So really conscious of time. I know that another quick question has just come in. Well, actually, a statement has come in from Sanjay. But again, Steve, you're today's dude, as it were. Is that something that you're willing to just give us a quick 60-minute response to Sanjay's
60-minute
and 60-second? I beg your pardon, 60-second response to Sanjay.
Well, no, I've got more. I don't have an answer. I've got questions. That sounds amazing, Sanjay. That sounds brilliant. So it's a system has design procedures where they give decisions without. So let me get this right. So people will make decisions. Decisions are made, but they leave it blank in terms of who's accountable. They don't want. Is it done because they're allowing people to decide where accountability is, or are they doing it because they don't want to take responsibility? You're on mute.
Unmute.
You're on mute. Sanjay, you're mute.
Let me unmute him.
So they are giving decisions without being accountable for it. That means they expect somebody else to take the responsibility. They have devised a procedure where, like I was in the Ministry of Defense back in India. I hope you can understand. So what is it? They've devised a procedure called defense procurement procedure, where you decide what you want, you make a case for it, you do everything for it, and you put it up to them for approval. Now, when you put it up for the approval, they, on whatever parameters they have in terms of bribe, etc., whatever, the shadow side, they will tell you change this, change that, and put it up again. So what happens is I change it, they said you change it. We never change it until something goes wrong tomorrow.
Brilliant. That's
and
amazing.
that is millions of dollars, because it's a big this thing, because defense program by the nature are high deals.
Yeah. Sanjay, thank you so much for that. That's so what a great way to close today, which is basically with more questions and thoughts rather than answers. Steve, it's been a fantastic session. We've gone way over time that we normally do, so I really appreciate your time and your attention, as well as everybody else's. Great session. I have to say, just as you responded to Sanjay, for me, I feel as if there's more questions that I've got rather than answers. So I hope that you will, as one of our as one of our masterclass individuals, as opposed to experts, stay within the community. So if there are any other questions from people, then you will be able to answer them. Again.